So how do we detect antibiotics in the environment? Well, one of the things that we can do is we can detect them in the water using GC or LC. So one of those two. Most of the time I use LC for this instead of GC because it's hard to get some of these things to go into the gas phase, but you can use, it depends on the antibiotic. So the cost of some of these things are about $500 to $700 per sample to run. So if you want to run this, it's very expensive. It's a very time-consuming methodology to do this. And so some of these, you're getting down to nanograms in the water per liter. And so you can detect pretty low concentrations, but it can be very, very expensive. The most common method is EPA method 1694. This was developed in 2007. And so this looks for it in water, soil, sediments, and biosolids. Biosolids are the stuff from sewage. So what happens is the solid part of it, the sludge, we call it biosolids. We put it on farm fields. That's what gets moved into that. And so we're looking at it using HPLC. I've done this method many times. It's, like I said, very time consuming in order to concentrate those antibiotics out of the environment in there. How do we look for antibiotic resistance? Well, we can use what's called a minimum inhibitory concentration plate. So we put the bacteria in, we grow it, and we put it onto a plate, and we see how resistant it is to different antibiotics. So I know I've gotten UTIs or urinary tract infections before, and they give me one antibiotic, and then the next day they call me up and go, oh, that one was resistant to that. So here's this other antibiotic we're going to give to you because my UTI is so bad in there. It's usually E. coli, just so you know. And then you can also do genetic markers. So you can look for DNA, you can look for genetics of it to see if it's there, but then you don't know if it's active or not. So looking actually at growing the antibacteria and doing this is probably the best way of doing it. So some case studies on how this gets into the environment. So here's one case study where they looked at, this was in Colorado, a river in Colorado, and they looked up upstream and downstream from a the water reclamation facility. That's a wastewater treatment plant. And they looked at it upstream and downstream. Upstream, they couldn't find it. Downstream, they could find resistance to the different antibiotics, and especially right at the concentrations were the highest of antibiotics right downstream from it. So there have been studies that show that wastewater treatment plants impact it. So wastewater treatment plants in Wisconsin. So they looked at it in the influent, that's the water that's coming in, effluent's the water coming out. They tested it. They could find these different antibiotics in the influent, so what was coming in, and a lot of them were still located in the effluent. There was a decrease in the concentration in there and the numbers of them, but still, we are still finding a lot of it inside of the effluent coming into our environment downstream from wastewater treatment plants. Some ways that we could decrease antibiotics is, and this is one where they used a vegetative buffer. So we talked about wetlands. You could talk about like different types of plantings so as the antibiotics get into the plants, the microorganisms in there help to degrade it. They get used up, and so there's different types of plants that could be used in order to control this. So wetlands are always a great way to get rid of that final polishing that you need to. Same thing with phosphorus. So we talked about the phosphorus rule, things like that too. CAFOs, or confined animal feeding operations, or concentrated animal feeding operations. This is where you just have animals everywhere inside of there. These are the factory farms. You can find these all over the place. If you go onto Google Earth, maybe I'll do that. I'll show you guys where all of them are located in the area and just how prevalent they are in this region. And so they're routinely given antibiotics. Ooh, I got that spelled wrong. Antibiotics. And they're giving it for prophylactic things. So a lot of times the people who own these facilities are working in concert with the big farm growers. So they're given the pigs and the food, or the animals and the food, and they're just told to grow the animals up. Once they grow the animals up, they give them back the animals grown up, and they don't even know what's inside the food. So a lot of times these little these farms that are located, the farmer doesn't even know what they're giving the animals. They're on contract with the big growers, and so they want to do what's right for the environment. They want to do what's right for the animals, but they don't even know. They're under contract. They're not allowed to know. They're just told what to feed the animals and what to do. And so a lot of times that causes problems inside of there. So swine CAFOs increase antibiotic-resistant genes. So this is one of the things that a study that was done in 2007, where they put manure, they stored it in these deep pits located right next to the animal feeding operations, and down gradient from it, they did mix, or those minimum inhibitory concentrations, and they did those downstream, and they found resistance to erythromycin and tetracycline, and they found higher concentrations of antibiotics downstream from these from a swine CAFO in there. We can use them to track sources. So this was an interesting study that was done in 2012, where when they looked at it, they were like, okay, we're finding antibiotic resistance here. This was done in Europe with a karst springs, so caves and cave systems, and they wanted to figure out, well, where is it coming from? And then they tested a whole bunch of different locations around the area, and they could backtrack it based upon the population of looking at the microbial community and the antibiotic resistance of the organisms that were coming out the spring. They could say which confined animal feeding operations was the source of their pollution inside of there. Antibiotic resistance in wastewater treatment plants and groundwater below leaking sewer lines. So sewer lines leak, especially as our infrastructure is getting older and older in this country. And as we're seeing resistance to a whole bunch of antibiotics getting inside of our groundwater, especially with our overuse of it, and we're starting to see multiple resistance of it. So groundwater is more vulnerable to residuals of certain types of antibiotics because of actinomyces is developing resistance, and so that's inside of our soil systems. So wastewater treatment plants can be a big source of antibiotics and antibiotic resistant genes. This is just a study I did down in Mexico. So here's Cancun, here's Tulum. This is called the Riviera Maya. This is the area between Cancun and Tulum. And what we were looking at, this is really where the tourist zones are here. And what we were doing was we were looking at caves and cave systems in the area and karst. So this is a drinking water supply for a city. This right here is a pipe that goes into the water and it pipes it for the local town. These other things are root systems for the plants, but this right here is a pipe that goes into this, and then you can see all the tourists having fun playing around inside of this water. So anything that happens on the surface here, it leaks immediately right into the groundwater supply and then gets into the drinking water supply, which is located about 14 kilometers from the coast. And so this water can be easily contaminated, especially when you have a lot of tourists, and you have tourists who are bringing antibiotics with them because they're like, oh, I'm going to Mexico, I need to be safe. And so it brings antibiotics and antibiotic resistance down to Mexico. And so again, we can use it as a source tracker. So what we were doing is looking at local communities. So and then we were looking at areas that were contaminated by tourists. We were also, there was not a lot of animal farming down there, so we weren't really worried about this at all. But we were looking at these sources of in here to see if we can figure out where the pollution was getting into their drinking water supply. So we did testing for antibiotic resistance. We collected water from things. We looked at different antibiotics that affect humans, infect animals, and we looked at different drugs that are approved for different countries. So a lot of times American tourists bring in their drugs that are not even used in certain countries into those areas, and we were looking for different antibiotics. And what did we find? Well, what we found was these are the percent of isolates that show high resistance. These are the different types of antibiotics. The black is resort populations. So this is where we know that there was a resort. Pristine means we don't know where the site, what might be contaminating it, or it's so far out in the jungle that nobody's bothering with it. Or native populations are the locals who live in those areas. So the locals are causing the problem, or locals are contaminating it. So we find that certain drugs like this, like streptomycin, we found a lot of resistance in areas that were affected by locals only, but then we get to certain antibiotics like lincomycin, it's just everywhere. Lincomycin resistant was just found everywhere. And then we come down to here to Cipro. Again, Americans love Cipro. I go on a trip. I mean, my friends are like, hey, just get some Cipro from your doctor. Well, we're finding that in resort populations, lots of antibiotic resistance in those. You get to things like erythromycin. It's not found in the pristine environments, but it's found wherever humans are found. And so we can kind of trace where these things are coming from and what possible livestock or what's causing the infections in there. So in conclusion, antibiotic use is current use in the United States for the animals is about 26.6 million pounds per year, while humans it's only 3 million pounds. So it's used a lot for animals. Reasonable estimates around 70% of all antimicrobials in the United States are given to animals, so that's one of the big sources of it. And they're the same classes of antibiotics. It's not like we save certain classes for humans in there. And unlike human waste, waste generated by farms does not undergo tertiary treatment, so it doesn't go through the full treatment. It doesn't have that chance to break it down. It doesn't get through that. Even though we are seeing them in wastewater treatment plants, we do find a lot of these CAFOs in there. And so the concentrations of antibiotics entering the environment is very high. And FDA doesn't limit the amount of antibiotics used by livestock producers. And there's no MCL for these. Well, why isn't there an MCL? This doesn't cause a problem. We give people drugs all the time. This is given to them. So there isn't a maximum concentration you can find in the environment. It's not regulated because it doesn't cause a health effect. I mean, this is causing antibiotic resistance. We also do individual drugs or individual compounds. We don't do classes, so we don't say total antibiotics must not exceed this amount. We do each individual compound, and this is part of the downside of the way we set up our MCLs, is because it's not just one compound, one MCL. It's not like classes of compounds. So that can cause some problems inside of there. Antibiotic use in the United States, animal versus human. So we find them. We use them a lot for growth promotion. For humans, never. We rarely use them for preventative health. A lot of times tourists do. Often used for preventative. We use very high concentrations for a very short time. In animals, it's usually very low concentrations for a very long time. And this is part of the problem inside of our humans problem. The government and policy marketplace incentives, there's some governments around the world like Sweden, Denmark, the EU is really trying to phase out antibiotic additives to there. In the US, we need to get the FDA behind this. And so, or consumers, I mean, like the marketplace, like if you want antibiotic free things. Now, milk is an interesting thing. Milk is always antibiotic free. If a cow is on antibiotics, they cannot go into milk production. So when milk says it's antibiotic free, it has to be. That's the law. You cannot have an animal on antibiotics and have that milk get into the milk supply. There's tests. They have to certify that there's no antibiotics in the milk. So when you buy milk that says it's antibiotic free, yeah, they all are. So that's greenwashing. That's washing it to make you think that you're getting something better. It's not. Now, our meats, on the other hand, and other things is a problem, but milk is not a problem when it comes to antibiotics. So they did a study in Denmark to see if we remove this, would this really change how much the animals grow, and would the producers of livestock have less efficiency and stuff. And when they completely withdrew the antibiotics for growth promotion or disease prevention, they did this in 2009, antibiotics decreased by 54% in Denmark. And they really did not see any like increasing in foodborne diseases in there. They only saw a modest decrease in the efficiency. So there was like basically a 0.03% decrease in the amount. So there was a little bit of loss of animals, but not really a lot when they come in there. And so this really did not change, especially for pigs, how much money they were making off of the pigs in there. And then, so the antibiotic sources of it, we can find in surface water, groundwater, drinking water. The sources are generally CAFOs, septic tanks, wastewater treatment plants. It's an emerging disease. But one thing I always like to point out is if you drink water with antibiotics, are you getting a therapeutic dose? Well, let's do some math here. Okay, so typically in the environment, we find about 1 nanogram per liter. Okay, so to about 1 microgram or microgram per liter in the environment. So typical doses for you in order to have a therapeutic dose is about 100 to 250 milligrams. Okay, and you have to take that twice or 3 times or something per day. So you figure that per day, if it's at 100, you're getting 300 milligrams per day. Okay, in order to get rid of that antibiotic, to kill off that organism. So you would need to drink, if you had 300 milligrams per day, you need to do that, and figure the concentrations at this high end, which is the 1 microgram per liter of water, into there. You would have to drink 300,000 liters of water per day, even if it's at the highest concentration ever found in the environment, for you to get a therapeutic dose. You're not going to drink that amount of water. There's no way you physically can. You will die from too much water. So, if you divide this number basically by 4, it gives you into gallons. So, it's about 100,000 gallons, a little less than that. But no, there's no way. So, even if this is in the environment, I always like to make sure that people realize that there's no way you're getting a therapeutic dose of this. So just in conclusion, this is from the EPA, showing all the different sources of antibiotics getting into the environment, all the different ways, from your toilets to hospitals to animal husbandry. I like this one over here in cemeteries. Kind of creepy. Animal husbandry areas, wastewater treatment plants, manufacturing facilities, all these different ways of how it's getting into the environment. So this is a really nice schematic showing all the different mechanisms for that. So with that, I'm going to stop. We're going to have our little fishies with our antibiotics into it. Have a good day.